So good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming the lack of attendance today is because everybody assumes nothing important will happen the day after an exam. Oh, for the next test, yeah, so we'll at least discuss some of them for the next test, but only if the battery fails again. Okay, so today we want to start talking and spend the next couple of days talking about models of international trade under imperfect competition. So remember, up to this point, one of the underlying assumptions that we've made is that we have perfect competition in terms of the markets in which we're competing at. And we saw that with that assumption that we had this notion of comparative advantage, where countries had differences either in technology or productivity or differences in factor abundance that led to significant differences in their comparative advantage. But we did all of that with this notion that markets were perfectly competitive, that we had similar prices across markets. And we ended up with the kinds of results that we've looked at with the Ricardian model, the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the standard trade model, so forth, and the other models that we've looked at so far. But it turns out that there are two significant features of international trade that these models are totally incapable of dealing with. So the first feature is there is a lot of trade that takes place between countries whose technologies, productivities, and factor endowments are relatively the same. So if we thought about Germany and the Netherlands, or Germany and France, or the Euro region, especially Western European region, the UK with the United States or Canada, or with Japan, these are all high-income countries. They're all countries with high levels of productivity. They're all countries with lots of capital. And yet there's a tremendous amount of international trade that takes place between those countries, even though there doesn't appear to be any basis for comparative advantage, or at least the basis of comparative advantage would be relatively small and way too small to actually explain the volume of trade that's taking place. Just to give you some idea, Western Europe and the United States and Japan and Canada, the trade between those four regions, or three regions really, accounts for more than 25% of total world trade. And yet these countries are very, very similar to one another. So we've got to have another way of thinking about why we have trade taking place between those types of countries. It can't be comparative advantage. The other big issue that our models of comparative advantage don't talk about is notice that we were always exporting one type of good and importing a very different type of good. So trade was between very dissimilar types of products. It actually turns out that a lot of trade, especially trade between advanced industrialized countries, is actually in products that are very similar, or at least within the same industry category. So for instance, if you look at machinery or machine tools, you would see exports from the United States to Western Europe, exports from Western Europe to the United States, and exports from both of those places to Japan, and from Japan, machine tools coming back the other direction. So these things are very similar. Now, these are not what we would think of as import-competing industries when it gets shipped in, because we're also exporting the object. Similar types of products. So we can see the same thing with airplanes, right? Boeing exports airplanes to Western Europe, and we import airplanes from Airbus. So we've got two-way trade in very similar types of products. Now, they're not homogeneous products, that's for sure. But if we thought about it in an industry category, machine tools, machinery, sophisticated chemicals, pharmaceuticals, a variety of other goods and services, we would see this pattern of two-way trade, something that we call intra-industry trade, trade within an industry. Again, our notion of comparative advantage and having differences in technology and factor abundances don't really account for intra-industry trade. Either you have a comparative advantage in aircraft, or you don't. You have a comparative advantage in machine tools, or you don't. It doesn't make sense to think about 3 or 4 different regions or countries as having a comparative advantage in the same product and trading them back and forth between each other. So we need to have, again, a different type of model that's going to help us to address those types of issues. So two things are going to happen when we talk about developing these new models. One is we need to think about a different kind of production system. So up until this point, in most production processes, we think of as being under the notion of constant economies of scale. If we double all the inputs, we get double the output. That's what constant economies of scale mean. Well, we can also have just economies of scale, by which we actually mean increasing economies of scale. So if we double all our inputs, we actually end up with more than double our output. So if that happens, then that creates a different dynamic and a different way of thinking about how international trade can take place. We'll work through an example of that in just a minute. And then both for international trade and especially intra-industry trade, once we talk about differentiated products, will also make a huge difference. So here we can think about two products that are very similar in the same category, Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s. These are center aisle, medium distance airplanes. They account for 80% of the commercial airplane fleet in the world. So this is the big workhorse, right? But they're not identical. They have different engines, they have different fuel economies, they have different seat designs, they have different aerodynamics. They've got lots of differences between them. But they're very, very similar types of items, but they're differentiated. And those differentiations, as we'll argue next time, can make a huge difference in terms of who's producing and what they're producing. Economies of scale. So when we have economies of scale, as I mentioned earlier, what it suggests is that if we double all of our inputs, we'll get more than double our output. Another way of thinking about that is that for each unit of output, as we increase production, the unit cost, the average cost per unit, will actually be declining. We'll be on the downward sloping portion of the average cost curve. We might actually be on a downward sloping portion of the marginal cost curve, but we need not be. So that's why we sometimes refer to this as decreasing cost, but it's also referred to as increasing returns to scale. Again, it just means that output is going to increase by more than the proportional increases in inputs. So let me give you a real simple example here. We use two countries, home and foreign. That was boring. Cloth and food. Now notice here, we're assuming identical production in both countries. So there's no differences in labor productivity, so we can't be using the Ricardian model. We're also going to assume that there are no differences in resource endowments. So we can't use the Heckscher-Ohlin standard trade model there, because what this basically suggests is that these two countries, home and foreign, have identical production possibilities frontiers. We'll also assume that the demand, the relative demands, are also identical between countries. Now, that's no different from the assumption we've basically been working with all of this time. So if their demands are the same and their production possibilities curves remain look the same, then their equilibrium in autarky is going to be at exactly the same point. The proportion of their cloth output versus their food output will be exactly the same between the two countries. Notice the total output could be different. One could be larger than the other in scale, but other than that, we look at exactly the same thing. That also means that their autarky relative prices are identical. Right? If our demand curves are the same, that means our country indifference curves are identical. If our production possibilities frontiers are identical, the tangency has to be at exactly the same point. So the slope of the ISO value budget line will be the same between the two countries. Ooh, how are we going to get international trade in that situation? Well, what we're going to assume is that both industries in both countries are actually subject to increasing returns or economies of scale. That's the key. So this becomes the key to producing this. So let's fill in some numbers here. So pre-trade, so this is going to be our autarky situation. So I'm going to make these two countries absolutely identical to each other. Both countries are going to have exactly 200 units of labor, and each country is going to divide their labor in half for each of the industries, cloth and food. And we're also, since they have the same productivity and resources, our outputs are also going to be the same. So let's just think about 1,000 units of cloth and 500 units of food. Notice we don't require the same productivity across industries, but we do require the same productivity across countries within an industry. So if we now look at world output, we would see that we're generating 2,000 units of cloth and 1,000 units of food. Now, what we want to ask ourselves is the following. Is there any way in which we could rearrange production between these two countries to get more output on a global basis? So let's think of the U.S. or home as, let's just let them specialize in cloth production. Okay? So they're going to have 200 workers in cloth. Notice that also means they have none in food. Well, if you don't have any workers in food, your output of food goes to zero. You slim down quite nicely. But our output, remember, our output is under increasing returns. So now it doesn't just double, it goes up by more than double. So let's just call it 2,500. Now the foreign country is going to specialize in the other good, in this case food. So again, they have nobody working in the cloth industry and there's no output there, but they've got 200 workers in food. Again, we have increasing returns to scale. So if we've doubled our output, we're going to get more than double our input. Let's just call it 1,500. So notice what happens to world output. We have more cloth being produced and we have more food being produced. Notice, there are no differences in technology. There are no differences in factor abundance. So just having increasing returns to scale says that we can increase world output by allowing each of the countries to specialize in an industry in which they have that increasing return. Now notice, it does not require that home produce cloth and foreign to produce food. It could be the other way around because the production technologies are exactly the same. The resource endowments are exactly the same. So if we had switched where the workers were in each country, we'd still be set with these two numbers. Foreign workers and home workers are equally productive given the other resources that they have. Now, of course, if you do this, what do we find? Home is incredibly well dressed, but very thin. And in foreign, well, they're a little plumper, but I hope it's warm. So this process of specializing here doesn't make any sense unless these two countries also engage in international trade. But notice again, we've increased world output, which means both countries, it's possible for both countries to actually consume more of both goods. Just the same result that we saw with our models of comparative advantage. Not that they have to, but it's possible that both countries could consume more of both goods. So what we see then is in this process, countries will be producing a limited range of goods and services, right? We become more specialized in terms of our productions. But we have to have international trade in order to consume the full range of goods. No trade, this doesn't make much sense. But with trade, it makes a lot of sense. And again, we get the full benefits of what we had seen earlier with comparative advantage. We get an increase in the world output of both goods. So again, this is a more efficient use of economic resources than an autarky situation. Same resources, more output, seems like a better outcome. Okay, so just two things to highlight right here. It's not always the differences between countries that leads to international trade. We can also have economies of scale, which will lead to international trade. But one of the things that we have to be careful about, we won't see this today because we're going to look at an extreme model today, but next week we'll see two examples where with economies of scale, the problem is we don't know which country is going to export which good. So notice if we come back here, it doesn't matter whether home is producing cloth or foreign is producing cloth. As long as one of the countries is specialized in cloth and the other is specialized in food, then we have this advantage from increasing economies of scale that world output can be increased. But we just don't know which. And we'll see that uncertainty. It's not an absolute uncertainty. There are certain things that we can say about it, but we'll have to look at that next week. So economies of scale, we know what they are. It turns out that models of economies of scale fall into two very different categories. One called internal economies of scale, the other external economies of scale. These are sufficiently different from one another that we will have to have separate models for them. So the number of trade models continues to explode, right? So it's a good thing, I guess, that the exams aren't cumulative. Okay, so for internal economies of scale, what we're talking about is that these scale issues occur at the firm level. So what we're saying is as the firm gets larger, the individual business firm gets larger, it is enjoying economies of scale. It can increase its inputs, get a larger increase in output, or that individual firm has decreasing average costs. When this occurs, a couple of things generally happen. We typically end up with an industry with just a few firms, but they're very large. Large compared to the size of the industry itself. So we know that when we only have a few firms that we run into issues of imperfect competition or less than perfect competition. So we might be looking at something like at one extreme a monopoly where one firm gets to be such a large size it controls the market, or an oligopoly where we actually have a few firms where each firm's pricing and production decisions depend upon its estimates of what the other firms are going to do with a lot of interdependency. Or if we continue to come down the scale and add a few more firms, we might have a situation of monopolistic competition. So we'll look at a monopoly today, and we're going to look at monopolistic competition next Tuesday. And I'll leave oligopoly for your game theory class. And again, it's important to notice that we have imperfectly competitive markets. So what's the hallmark of an imperfectly competitive market? Yes? Okay, price does not equal marginal cost, which means what if we were to draw a picture of it? Okay, the profits, yes. There might be losses too, but... Okay. So one of the things that we know, the demand curve faced by the firm, as opposed to the industry, is downward sloping. That's the key. In a perfectly competitive market, remember the firm is a price taker. Whatever it produces or doesn't produce is so small relative to the size of the market that it cannot influence the market price, which means that for a perfectly competitive firm, the demand curve is horizontal. So as we introduce imperfect competition into the marketplace, what we see is the demand curve faced by the firm starts to have a downward slope to it. And how much it slopes down depends upon lots of things that I hope they talk about in microeconomics. Okay, for most industries that have internal economies of scale, we also have very large fixed costs in production. So we can think about that as having very substantial startup costs, right? But the actual variable cost of production might be substantially lower. So you might think of an industry like steel, right? You can't make steel without building a steel mill. They're big, they're expensive. Or autos, or chemicals, or petroleum, or pharmaceuticals. All of those require a huge upfront investment before you can even produce the product. But producing the individual product may, not always the case, but it may actually be fairly low. Right? So think about a pharmaceutical company, generally costs somewhere between $1 and $5 billion to develop a new pharmaceutical. The average cost of producing a new pharmaceutical, once it's developed, somewhere between 5 and 10 cents. So very low marginal cost or average variable cost, but very high fixed cost. And we'll see what that does here in just a second. But before we do that, let's talk about external economies of scale. External economies of scale are very weird. Because here, the economies of scale depend upon the size of the industry, but not necessarily the size of the individual business firm. So it's possible, and it's generally the case actually, with external economies of scale, that you have a large number of relatively small firms. And each provides a slightly differentiated product. Which actually means we're closer to perfect competition than, let me call it, traditional imperfect competition. Now, we'll talk in much, much more detail about external economies of scale next Thursday. So notice we're going to talk about internal economies of scale, specifically monopolistic competition on Tuesday, and then we'll talk about external economies of scale next Thursday. So if this doesn't make sense to you yet, don't worry. Next Thursday it probably won't either, but that'll be a bigger problem. But it's not a problem for today. Okay, so one of the things that we want to think about with imperfect competition and international trade is how we want to approach this in terms of thinking about how the firm behaves both in an autarky situation as well as what that firm can do in an international trade situation. So the easiest way to think about imperfect competition is go to the extreme. Let's suppose that we have a monopoly firm. Now, a monopoly firm, of course, means there's only one firm. So the firm is the industry. So we have one very large firm here, where large is, again, suggesting relative to the size of the industry. As we discussed just a minute ago, this means that the demand curve will be downward sloping. It also means that the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping.